Hey folks, here's a story about how a 1973 Supreme Court decision leads inadvertently to the formation of the furry fandom. Welcome to Tea Party Thursday. I'm your host, Marcy Fox, and let's dig into this. So, in 1973, there's a man that goes by the last name Miller in California, and he is in the business of selling explicit content, which is sort of a risky business back in the day. He has to do this through mail, and those mailed letters end up in sort of hands that don't want them, and they press charges for on Miller for obscenity. Obscenity at the time is a very vague and nebulous term. It really can basically be anything that's NSFW in nature. And so this really is the early standard is a very restrictive one for artists because it's very nebulous. They don't really know what's crossing the line, and if you're in the wrong community, it's very broad, and courts are allowed to interpret it in a lot of different ways. Miller kind of does two things. It carves out what is not protected by the First Amendment, and that's the term used obscenity. It's basically the crossing the line stuff, if you think about that. But it also sort of carving it out sort of tells you more accurately what is protected. And generally speaking, just regular old NSFW content is generally protected. So this leads to a wave of artists after 1973 and in the 70s and early 80s. This leads to a wave of artists that start exploring with the idea of NSFW or explicit content in their artwork. This is around this exact time we see a lot of anthropomorphic little micro fandoms popping up in the nerd culture, and also we start to see the first what would become furry art collectives. These are groups that dragged in a bunch of anthropomorphic artists, people who wanted to draw anthropomorphic characters and maybe SFW or NSFW scenes, and they sort of created between these artists. They took turns making graphic novels, incorporating sort of their characters, experiences, and whatever they else wanted to show in their art under sort of this broad editorial organization. There were multiple art collectives in the early days of the fandom that would put out graphic novels to communicate anthropomorphic ideas. In the early days, before the era of the internet, which really is where furry takes off. But in the early days, we were referred to as funny animal comics. People who made funny animal comics, and funny animals would actually be comics would be or funny animals in general. People who draw funny animals would be a term that would carry on through the early days of the very early furry fandom. And that's really spurred on largely because of this ability for artists, this sort of the broader art community sort of projecting itself, in my opinion at least. This is my disclosure, my personal opinion. The broader art community projecting itself onto what's going on in the furry fandom at the time. You see people of all walks of life. I don't really think there's any nailing down any one particular group or individual group or community that really has a very strong individual influence. These are a lot of people from all sorts of different walks of life engaging in making anthropomorphic content, sometimes SFW, sometimes NSFW, oftentimes sort of hybrid in between, exploring with the ideas of like slice of life, incorporating, this sort of for example, an early comic I think captures this really well is Omaha, which has very much explicit themes, but also sort of digs into more of a deeper storytelling through the work. So, eventually you start getting to the first room parties and cons. Room parties actually serve an interesting place in the early days of the fandom because a lot of times you couldn't have enough furries in the community to have a single a con, so you'd have a room party and an existing con where it's probably some stuff going on that was sort of boring the modern fandom, but also this is sort of functioning as the really main way that furries in the local area can meet up in the context of like a broader this would serve the same kind of role that local cons serve today. And room parties at sort of like Comic-Cons or nerd conventions. Remember, this is the early 80s into the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. You really start to see the emergence of nerd culture and sort of comic books and trading cards and all that fun stuff. Tabletop games start to explode. So, of course, we really start to see a rise in conventions. not enough furries to really have a convention, but you have like wing parties. Conference is kind of the first furry convention that happens in the mid 80s and goes into the 90s. Some infighting in that con sort of breaks it up. And already we're starting to see the early days. We're already starting to see that argument about how much explicit content should be shown. By the first fifth furry convention ever, we're starting to see the first signs that people are having a debate about how much explicit content should be shown publicly at a furry convention and how that impacts the image of the fandom as a whole. So certainly not a new argument. The term burned furs kind of took the role, was taken over by the pure furs. If you ever heard the term like pure fur used, yeah, before it was term burned, the term was burned furs, and described people who were not super happy with the amount of explicit content that was going on in the early days of fandom, which, to be fair, was a little bit different than what we see in modern cons because, for example, Conference had something referred to as a slave auction. They changed it to a pet auction, but basically said they kept the same concept, so, you know, a little bit of a different degree. There was more influence from people that were enthusiastic about dogs back in the early days of the fandom too, which is unfortunate, and gladly we kind of dealt with that. But certainly, yeah, there were some early growing pains in this. But I think the big point here is that when people say that the fandom has a kinky origin, they're kind of, I think, missing. It's not really one really even kink groups that really spur that on. It's a fundamental change in the way Americans do art and can do art, and a lot of that is spurred on by the Miller case. So yeah, I think it's kind of right and kind of misconstrued a little, but yeah, the fandom does sort of get its early days because you have to remember that these early fandoms before the furry convention that would become or furry community that merged together to sort of become the furry community were based on films that were kid friendly, and so there were films and there's not a whole lot you can do with that. And so really where we start to see the isolation and the formation of the furry fandom is really around these art collectives that are doing sort of experimenting with the idea of explicit content in these works of the anthropomorphism and the explicit content. And that really starts in the 70s, continues on through the 80s, and then by the time you get to the 90s, mucks pop up, and it's the rest is history. So, but anyways, yeah, I hope you all enjoyed the video and learned something today, and I will see y'all around soon. Actually, I'll see you tomorrow with a new rock video. I don't know what rock I'm going to use yet, but I'm sure it's going to be really cool. So, hope y'all enjoy, and I'll see y'all around soon.